I'm going to throw out a few of the questions that we've had and let you kind of discuss them if that's okay, just to try and get everything together, because there has been such an amount of engagement with your presentations. So I suppose, again, I'll direct some of the questions specifically as they were asked, but obviously then others can feel free. So for Saif, where do you see the intersection between the law and ecological sufficiency when we see laws being made that are actively promoting economic growth at all costs?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's quite a tricky one. Our environmental legislation tends to come from Europe now, and of course the European approach to environment and climate policy is very much within the sort of ecological modernization, the idea that we can have continued growth, but we need to decouple economic growth from material use and from greenhouse gas emissions. And as I was trying to explain, that is even theoretically almost impossible to do. It's impossible to get to the level of per capita emissions and resource use if we're still producing more and more and consuming more and more to generate economic growth. So something needs to happen at a European level for sure. And I think at the national level, what's missing is a strong policy commitment to environmental protection, first off. It's just absent. So we have a very poor record in implementing European environmental law. And the EPA itself has been calling for some time for a comprehensive policy statement on the environment. And you wouldn't think in 2022 you'd need that. But they're saying that there is just a lack of joined up thinking around environmental policy in Ireland. We're not confronting some of these major dilemmas, especially around land use, not just in relation to agriculture, but around biodiversity, forestry policy, and land use generally. So I think there's a huge amount of work we need to do, to answer your question, on the pure regulatory and legal frameworks to get our house in order. And we're very behind in that respect, which is dreadful, because we're confronting an emergency scale operation now, and we don't have the legal toolkits that we really need. There's been amazing work, by the way, done by the Climate Bar Association. They're looking into this, and I haven't seen their proposal for a comprehensive environmental rights-based law, but I think they're working on that, and I think that could be a very interesting way forward.
Great, thank you very much. There's a question in from John Barry, actually, and there's also a follow-up from John, so I'll ask it and I'll throw it out because it is relevant to all of your presentations. You talk and interact with policymakers, journalists, academics, politicians, etc. in Ireland. Do they get the need to move beyond growth? What is the issue in shifting their mindsets? This is actually a big question for me, is the how. Is it the way we teach economics, an ideology, a sense of groupthink, all of the above? Even with the Green Party, they don't seem to question growth. For them and the others above, the solution is green growth, which is wish fulfillment. And then a related question, perhaps mainly for Tom, is modern economics or neoclassical an ideology? It's not objective, value-free or neutral, yet mainstream economists pretend it is, and more worryingly, our media portrays economic experts as objective and non-political. Discuss.
Will I go first? Yeah, well, look, obviously everyone has an ideology. There's nothing truly objective, and any economist that says that they are purely a positive economist rather than a normative economist is essentially a charlatan who you should immediately become suspicious of. The reality is we all have our different ethical backgrounds. We all care about different things to different extents, whether it be inequality or any other dimension. Some people think about security more than others. So the idea that it's non-ideological is a sense a nonsense. Everything is ideological, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't objective facts. Of course there are, but it's important to appreciate that what economists usually try and do is model different scenarios, and they try to forecast the future, and they try and create quasi experiments to see if national minimum wage, for example, increases unemployment rates or whatever it might be, would an increase in the corporation tax rate lead to a reduction in FDI? These type of questions, but they're very limited. We are very limited in what we can do. So really, we should think of economists as probing and maybe sometimes being helpful in terms of how you conceptualize the problem, in terms of incentives, for example, or whatever it might be. But I think it is very problematic when people like economists are treated like sages and are given more weight than they really deserve. And it is an issue, and economists do it all the time. They essentially use the language of economists to quash any debate or discussion, and we've all seen it happen. And all economists are prone to it. Some of us try to avoid doing it. So it is highly problematic, and you do then end up with politicians being inundated by business leaders and so forth, saying that if you do X, Y, or Z, it's going to kill thousands of jobs. And a politician then has to decide, well, do I take that risk? This guy might be a professional liar, but I don't know. Is it worth taking the risk that he or she may take away thousands of jobs, or he would have this impact upon whatever particular sector, because you've increased wages, or you've increased the tax rate, or you've improved environmental regulation. But there is a risk there. So I guess what I'm getting at is that fear by the generalist is a big motivating factor, and there is inertia as well, and lock-in. So we get locked into what's normal to us. So the world around us is normal. So a radical shift from that can seem crazy or unimaginable. And it does require things like the COVID pandemic to show that genuine social insurance and income adequacy is possible, that a greater role for the state is actually possible and maybe even desirable. So in many ways, it's our lack of experience that kind of leads to the kind of fear. And also because the climate crisis, unlike the COVID pandemic, is a real slow drowning of the frog rather than a quick burning. You don't see it happening. So we don't see it on a day-to-day basis, particularly in Ireland, and therefore we don't give it the proper net present value, I suppose, to use economics terms. We don't value the 20, 30 years down the line in the same way we do today. And even though we care about our children and future generations, it's just not part of our day-to-day. And we live in the day-to-day, and that creates the problem. So it's institutional issues. I guess I would steer people away from kind of it's a great conspiracy, although of course they're self-interested and don't care about you, but it's not coordinated in that sense. A lot of it is to do with fear, and fear about alternatives. I don't know if that answers the question or tries to take a stab at it at least.
Yeah, no, thank you. And just, I suppose, to the first part of that question, and for all of you again, how do we make that shift, that transformation from, what our current policymakers' thinking is to what we actually need to happen? Like, we've seen the introduction of the wellbeing framework, but, having had a look at the second report, it doesn't seem like it's actually creating any better framework for well-being, because it all depends on the metrics that are used. So is there a how to make this change?
I think there's a few steps in it. One is to recognize that the system overall doesn't really engage very well with change. It doesn't basically see the need for it very much. It thinks much of the time that the people advocating are exaggerating. It doesn't at all internalize the IPCC and the various other reports, the things that should be having the hair standing on top of their heads if they have any hair, that is. But the sort of stuff, like that you'd look for, we deal, Colette knows this, Suzanne is on this meeting as well. Like, we have a huge engagement with policymakers on a day-to-day basis. And their lack of knowledge is staggering, just put it that way. And secondly, when you make a serious effort at making some progress in that area of dealing with that, their refusal to accept the obvious is also quite staggering. So I think there's big issues in that. Part of the problem is that they work in silos, I think. And so they deal with this piece over here of reality, or else they're dealing with a piece over there, and those two pieces never meet. Although they might be bouncing off each other and interlinked in all sorts of ways, but for analytical purposes, they're pulled apart and they're experts in one or the other. Tom talked about them being sages. I got into a lot of trouble several years ago for referring to them as the new high priesthood, that the media kept referring to back to economists. So if anything went wrong or if anything was happening, they brought in an economist, and a very narrow group of economists. Because I mean, in fairness, Tom, I think we would appreciate very much your broad approach on this stuff. Okay, and there are others there as well that we support. But geez, there's a lot of economists with a very narrow view of the world, and they very often tend to be the commentators. And they're held as if once they've said it, that's the end of it. There's no further discussion. So much for the sages. The other piece I think that's important is it goes back to one of the pieces that was raised by John in the question. I think there's a problem with the teaching as well. I mean, it shouldn't be speaking ill of the dead, and this isn't speaking ill of them. It's just to say a fact. Brendan Walsh eliminated the teaching of history as part of economics at one point in UCD. You're kind of tearing your hair out and sort of saying, like, you have nothing to learn from history in economics. This is insane. This is crazy stuff. So it's that kind of failure to understand what's required, as well as keeping them under pressure. I remember years ago asking Gareth Fitzgerald, now that he was out of office, what was the most effective way of getting a government to listen to what your position was? And he said very simply, embarrass them. So he denied afterwards that he ever said that to me, but I know he did. Okay, and he obviously, when he was close to office, he knew that was the most effective way. Now, I think what I would be in saying that, I think what I would be saying is not to be backwards and coming forwards about what our positions actually are, naming the reality and saying basically, like I was saying in my presentation, the Taoiseach is wrong to say society cannot afford, or the budget cannot afford to pay welfare at the levels that are required to be paid. Like, he's just plain wrong. End of story. Now, I'm quite happy to engage him in the numbers at any time. No, needless to say, he won't engage, but that's another day's work.
And he's unlikely to be tuning in.
That's probably true too, but we'll get an opportunity on Monday to tell him,
Okay, with that, thank you very much.